So finally, we come to the introduction to SQL. Right? What is SQL? SQL is the standard way of relational database operation. We have been talking about relational database. We talked about that it's the most popular implementation of database systems in the past 50 years. SQL is the standard way of relational database operation. No matter which database you use, as long as it's a relational database, you will be using SQL. SQL contains information statements to create, maintain, and drop tables. It also contains insert statements to manipulate data, insert, update, delete, and query. SQL is a descriptive language. It's not procedural. That's why a lot of computer site or textbook says it's not a programming language, but the people do recognize this as a computer script or tool that you can use. And SQL has an ANSI standard. It's the same across different vendors. The latest ANSI standard is SQL 2016. Like we just said, SQL has two types of statements. The first is the data definition language, or DDL. You will see this in many SQL documentation. These statements include create, drop, and alter. You also have the data manipulation language, DML. This includes insert, update, delete, and select. These seven are the most important statements of SQL. To understand these seven statements, why seven statement is seven statement enough, right? A lot of students, after learning like programming languages like Java or Python, have this question: are these seven statements good enough for data manipulation? In order to answer this question, we need to look at the life cycle of data. How does data exist in computer system? Basically, for all the data sets, we say there's something called CRUD, or create, read, update, and delete, or CRUD. This is the general life cycle of data in any computer system. So in order to have a data set, you first need to create it, right? You need to create the data set. Then you will read from it. Because when you create a data set, you put data in, and only when you read it can you make use of the data, right? This is not an archiving solution. This is not like a compliance archiving solution where you dump the data in and don't really expect people to read it until something happened and someone want to some government agency want to look at it. But this in normal business scenario, when you create this data set, you expect people to read it, and you expect people to read it in a consistent manner. So this is a read part of data lifecycle. And after you read, you may discover issues with the data, or maybe the data itself is changing. So you need to update the database, the data set as things goes. You need to update it. And finally, once this data set submission is done, you will delete it. You don't want it to occupy your memory storage or memory or storage. So this CRUD, create, read, update, delete, is a life cycle of the data, of any data set. It's a life cycle of any data set, not only SQL specific. Even if you are working on some other model, like a non-relational model, no SQL database, that where you don't have you're not using SQL, you still have the same concept of the life cycle. You still have to perform these 4 steps of the life cycle. But in relational database, these 4 steps of the life cycle, the whole life cycle, is achieved by using SQL. And in order to create a data set, we have 2 statements, which is create, insert. Remember when we talked about database table, we said you will define a table first. You will define what columns exist in the table, then you will populate the table by inserting data into it, right? So this is the corresponding SQL statements that we will have in the create step, where you have a create statement to create the table and insert statement to insert the table. Then you will read it by using the SQL select statement. Then maybe you want to update the data. You want to update, certainly you can do either alter, which adds more columns to it, or which changes the columns, the column definitions of the table, or you use the update, where you update the actual data. Then you also have an insert and delete. And apparently we know how it works. You can insert new data, you can delete old data. And finally, when you do not need the data set anymore, you will drop it. So these 7 statements, create, insert, select, alter, update, delete, and drop, forms the whole SQL statement body that will implement the data lifecycle in any relational database. We will start by talking about create and the drop first.